All right, I see that we have hit the 6 o'clock hour. I will get things started. Welcome to Marylanders to Prevent Gun Violence's 2022 Legislative 101. I'm Liz Bannock, Executive Director of Marylanders to Prevent Gun Violence. And we're really so pleased to have you here today on this Martin Luther King evening. I think, of gun violence is definitely an issue of equity. And I think there's no better way to honor the great Martin Luther King Jr. Than to acknowledge that all people deserve to live in communities free from gun violence. I want to acknowledge a few people, a little bit of housekeeping at the beginning. If you have questions, please put them in the comments. We'll be going through the comments as we move forward, and we'll definitely be taking those questions in written form. We have a lot of people to thank today, not the very least our speakers, Delegate Pena Melnick, Melissa Wiley, all the amazing partners at March for Our Lives who are working with us today. But I also want to give a really big thank you to our Legislative Director, Karen Herron, who pretty much single-handedly put this presentation together, and to Bonnie Schofield, who helped her tremendously. But these two ladies, I wouldn't be able to do this work without them, and I'm just so grateful to them. I also want to recognize Sarah Shinning, the Legislative Director for Senator Van Hollen. Senator Van Hollen has been a steadfast supporter of gun violence prevention work, and as a state senator for Maryland, he worked with Carol Price, whose 13-year-old son, John, was shot and killed by a 9-year-old neighbor in an unintentional shooting. State Senator then Van Hollen worked with Carol. They passed a piece of legislation that made integrated locks necessary in Maryland. So any gun sold after 2003 in Maryland, any handgun sold, had to have this device inside of it. And Senator Van Hollen has just gone on to continue to support gun violence prevention efforts, and we're so grateful to him. And thank you, Sarah, for being here to acknowledge that support. If there are other legislative folks here, please put that in the chat, and we'll make sure to acknowledge you as well. Marylanders Prevent Gun Violence really began as a small organization that initially worked to ban the Saturday Night Special, a really cheap, inexpensive gun that was doing a lot of awful things in Baltimore City. We did that successfully in 1988, and we've gone on to do a number of other things. We have eliminated the politically biased Handgun Permit Review Board. Again, I'll shout out Bonnie Schofield, who led this effort, and many of you attended those meetings and did really helpful work just seeing all the awful things that board was doing. We passed the Extreme Risk Protective Order. We passed the Firearms Safety Act of 2013. We provided funding for violence intervention and prevention programs through the MDVIP. And you'll see here from the slide that Karen's put up many other things we've been able to do over the last few years. We also co-lead the Maryland Violence Prevention Coalition. This is a group of organizations and individuals who are dedicated to reducing violence in all forms, from domestic violence to community violence. And we run a small community violence prevention program ourselves. That program is led by our own really amazing Reverend Dr. Greta Willis. It's a group of women from the community in West Baltimore who provide support to children at Liberty Elementary School who've been identified as being at risk by their teachers. And Miss Greta and her team go in on a weekly basis to provide support to these elementary age youth. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to Sid Shaw. He is the March for Our Lives Maryland Policy Coordinator. Sid, you want to take it from here?
Yeah, thank you so much, Liz. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this really important and impactful night. Again, first, I would take my time to thank Marylanders to Prevent Gun Violence for inviting our chapter of March for Our Lives to this training and Legislative 101. I, along with everyone else at the Maryland chapter, am really excited to work towards educating the public and talking with legislators and lobbying about these impactful bills. So again, my name is Sid Shah. Thank you for your introduction, Liz. I am the policy coordinator at March for Our Lives. And today I'm joined by Isabel and Corey, both of whom are members from our chapter's policy committee, as well as Isra and Malvika, who are both our state directors, and a few other members from our chapter. Just for a quick rundown of our organization, March for Our Lives was founded after the tragedy that occurred at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida in 2018. And so ever since that first march in DC, we've been advocating for gun violence prevention, especially geared towards preventing school shooting incidents. And our organization is completely student run, from the local to state all the way to the national level. And to focus a little bit on what the Maryland chapter has specifically been working on in the past few months, we've held events across the state focusing on our anti-NRA campaign, our SRO reform campaign, and now we're focusing on the MGA's 2022 legislative session and related bills. With that, I thank everyone again for coming tonight, and I'll pass it back to Karen to talk about tonight's agenda.
All right, I'm juggling computers here. Thank you, Sid. As Sid stated, I am Karen Herron, Legislative Director at MPGV. Before I jump into things, I first and foremost want to take a moment to thank you for being here, for being engaged, and for being willing and able to take efforts to help curb the awful trend of gun violence in America, and specifically in Maryland. And then I'll move on to discuss, just skipped ahead. Tonight, after the introductions and our guest speaker, we will cover the state of violence in America, specifically Maryland, and then we'll move on to discuss our two key pieces of legislation: child access prevention and ghost guns. At any point during tonight's discussion, you are welcome to pop questions into, I think it's the chat tonight, and we will try to address as many as possible, either during the presentation in the chat itself or at the end of the presentation if we can. But first, I want to introduce you to Melissa Willey. Melissa's beautiful daughter, Jalen, was shot and killed in her school in St. Mary's County in 2018. Jalen's killer got his gun from his father, who failed to adequately store his firearm. We honor her with this legislation in the hopes that its passage can protect others. Melissa will speak about her daughter and why she feels this bill is so important, and then she will be introducing our guest speaker tonight, Delegate Penny Melnick. Melissa.
Good evening. Thank you for again having me. First off, the picture of Jalen, I didn't notice it right away, and I saw it, and it just like takes my breath actually that I see her up there and part of for this legislation. I just wanted to, I was looking for what I was supposed to say. I just wanted to, to talk a little bit quickly about Jalen. She was 16. She had just been asked to the prom twice, actually. She was asked by the shooter, and she was asked by another young man, and she accepted the invite from the other young man. She didn't get to go. She was a swimmer. She was one of 9 children, now 10 actually, and she's just missed. She's missed incredibly by my kids, by me. The little things. Even today is one of my other girls' 16th birthday, and she misses that. So it's just I really would like to stand by this and get it pushed through, with hopes that something like this we can prevent or help prevent something like this. I always say does not happen, and I hate to say this, but sometimes I lose faith that this won't continue to happen. But at least maybe if it's just one other family that doesn't have to go through this, I'll fight for whatever I can. I am supposed to introduce someone, and I am looking for what I am supposed to say to that. And it is not showing up. Hang on 1 second. I'm sorry about that. There we go. I'm sorry.
I'm right here, Melissa.
I know I'm supposed to introduce you.
It's okay. It's okay. Everything that's needed is right up there. My name and
I found it.
it's all right. I have to say, I'm sorry for your loss. You know, you are definitely honoring your daughter. You're making a difference. And there's a Buddhist saying that says that you don't die when your body is cremated or you're buried. You die when the last deed you have performed on earth is forgotten, and your work and your daughter's life will forever be honored for the work you're doing. So I thank you on behalf of my colleagues and the state of Maryland for getting up in the morning, as hard as it is, for making a difference. I thank you for it.
Thank you. And thank you for supporting this and being here tonight.
My pleasure.
Sorry, I failed on introducing you.
No, you did not. You did beautifully. Okay. And I thank you for being here. And I want to say good evening and thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor, and happy Martin Luther King Jr. Day. What an amazing day to honor his legacy by the work that we are all doing, especially this group and especially Melissa. And being an advocate and using your voice to make a difference. I am here because I want to lend my voice today to advocate for the legislation that has been mentioned, for legislation that will help prevent and decrease gun violence in Maryland. You know, the United States is suffering from a gun violence epidemic. Mass shootings occur regularly and gun ownership is a commonplace. Every day in America, 32 children and teens are injured. 7 are killed by gunfire. Firearms are the second leading cause of injury-related death in children. And the rate of firearm-related suicide in children has increased by over 30%. As policymakers and leaders of the community, it is our responsibility to change these trends and implement legislation that protects our children. According to the Gun Violence Archive, there have been at least 58 school shootings since August 1st. Did you hear that? 58 school shootings since August 1st. Access to firearms creates an environment where our children are in danger every single day, and it shouldn't be. As policymakers, restricting access to firearms is something we can control. We can make a difference. We can pass these bills. The COVID-19 pandemic brought significant changes to students across the US. I have seen it. I am living it with my constituents. Switching to virtual learning and a decreased access to school-based services such as social workers, which are so important, counselors, and behavioral therapy has significantly impacted the mental health and well-being of our youth. ER visits for mental health during the pandemic are up 24% for 5 to 8 years old, and up 31% for 12 to 17 years old. Our children are struggling, and it is this vulnerable state we need to ensure that they are protected from gun violence. They shouldn't have to struggle this way. In 2020, suicide was the 3rd leading cause of death for ages 10 to 34 in Maryland. Can you believe that? Areas that have higher rates of gun ownership also have higher rates of suicide death by a firearm, especially among children. The current child access prevention laws are meant to protect children from assessing firearms by holding a parent or guardian responsible for the actions a child may take with a firearm. These laws allow prosecutors to bring charges against adults who intentionally or carelessly allow children to have unsupervised access to firearms. Child access prevention laws have been proven effective. States with the most restricted access laws have had the greatest reduction in firearm fatalities in children under 15. It is estimated that 4,000 deaths of all pediatric firearm deaths in children between the ages of 0 and 14 could have been prevented if all 50 states had passed the strongest type of negligence laws. That is 4,000 parents that do not have to bury their children. Current Maryland law provides that a person may not store or leave a loaded firearm in a location where the person knew or should have known that an unsupervised child would gain access to the firearm. A child in Maryland is defined in current law under this law as a person under the age of 16. And violating this section is a misdemeanor punishable by no more than $1,000 fine. This provides little guidance and basically negates the adult gun's owner responsibility when children over 16 are involved, and they should still be found responsible. Maryland does not have any generally applicable safe gun storage mandate for gun owners. This session, we seek to change this by introducing the following bills. The bill that was discussed is named after Jaylene Rose Wiley, who again, Melissa, you're making her proud. As you heard, she was killed by a fellow 17-year-old student who brought his father's gun to school. This bill will repeal the age prohibition and extend the policy to anyone under the age of 18, not 16. It also will increase the punishment to a misdemeanor with a maximum sentence of up to 90 days in prison or a maximum fine of $1,000. It is essential that we pass this session, Jaylene's law. Melissa, I pray that you see this happen. Please don't give up hope. We can do it and we will do it because we need it to protect our children in our community. We need to protect them from harm. It is the right thing to do. In addition to Jaylene's law, we have ghost guns are also an immediate concern. A ghost gun is a fully functioning firearm made with either a kit or printed using a 3D printer. The gun is made entirely at home, and unlike traditional guns, ghost guns do not have serial numbers, making them untraceable. You can't trace them. Maryland currently has no law restricting untraceable firearms or undetectable firearms, and this proposed legislation will ban minors from owning ghost guns. It also prohibits them from being made in front of a child. You know, our children are what they see. It is important for us to protect them. These two bills are essential in protecting our communities. They're essential in ensuring our children that they have a safe place to learn, to grow, to thrive, to be children. We're taking necessary steps to secure the future of our young kids. I want to thank this coalition for making gun regulation a priority, for the time you spend coming to Annapolis, for the time you spend sending us email, for the time you spend making calls, for the time you spent speaking to people and getting the message out, because it makes a difference. I want to also thank the bill sponsors, Lopez and Bartlett, who are actually sponsoring this legislation, this session. I know that we can work together to help gain support for these bills and protect not only our young people, but all Marylanders, because it's definitely the right thing to do. Don't give up. Keep trying. We will listen. It is worth it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Delegate. We are absolutely thrilled to have you here tonight and to be working with us on convincing legislators that more must be done to keep firearms out of the hands of our state's youth. I also want to take a moment and thank delegates Jessica Feldmark and Chanel Branch, who've also tuned in this evening thank you for being here and for caring about these issues. Let's turn now to why we are doing this work. Gun violence in the United States is absolutely incomparable to that in any other high-income country, and it keeps getting worse. In the 4 years between 2016 and 2019, gun violence claimed the lives of an average of 39,000 Americans a year. 2020 saw those numbers jump 14% to over 45,000. While part of this spike might be an anomaly due to the extraordinary conditions of the early days of the pandemic and the political unrest felt around the US, no matter how you look at it, 40,000 lives are what we are currently losing to gun violence each year. Last year, I testified before the General Assembly, warning that the sharp increase in gun sales, coupled with the unique situations brought on by COVID-19, put our children especially at risk from increased violence in the home, at risk from the most lethal means of suicide, at risk to increased gun access. Sadly, this proved to be too accurate. Quoting a recent study in the Journal of Pediatrics evaluating the impact of these factors, quote, "The combination of unparalleled firearm sales, heightened social and economic distress, and children atypically home from school created a uniquely risky environment for firearm injury," end quote. While total hospital encounters of youth decreased by 42.3% in 2020, firearm-related encounters increased by 38.8%. Phrased a different way, while in general, children were more safe from the normal things that send them to the hospital, they were significantly more impacted by gun violence in 2020 than in prior years. I'm going to hand over to Bonnie, who's going to talk a little bit about the faces of gun violence.
Thanks, Karen. I'm Bonnie Schofield, Program Director here at MPGV. Before I start, I want to also give a shout out and a welcome to Delegate Courtney Watson, who has joined us this evening as well. Thank you to all of the legislators who are joining us in this fight. So we are often asked to give detailed numbers on what is happening in Maryland specifically. So I'm going to share with you some of the numbers that we know. We know that generally Maryland loses over 700 lives to gun violence each year, and an additional 1,700 plus are wounded by firearms. These are lives like 17-year-old Edwin Juarez, who was shot and killed on Christmas Day in 2020 in Charles County when he and 2 other teenagers were handling a firearm. The gun discharged while in the possession of a 13-year-old, shooting Edwin in the chest. And 16-year-old Jalen Willie, who was killed at her high school in St. Mary's County, as you heard, when a 17-year-old brought his father's gun to school, killing her and injuring another youth. And 8-year-old PJ Evans, who was shot and killed inside his home in Prince George's County while playing video games when someone opened fire outside his apartment complex. And Brian and Kelly Robinette of Ellicott City, who were shot to death by Brian's disturbed brother, who apparently believed that as a pharmacist, Brian was killing people with COVID vaccinations. And we cannot close 2021 without talking about the execution-style killing of Dante Barksdale, who was a Safe Streets violence interruption leader in Baltimore, who literally laid down his life to help turn this tide of bloodshed. So I'm going to turn you over now to Isabel to talk more about the Maryland data.
Hi, I'm Isabel Zapata from March for Our Lives, Maryland. From the Education Fund to Stop Gun Violence analysis of CDC data for 2019, we know that 62% of the gun deaths in Maryland are homicides, 35% are suicides, and that there has been a 15% increase in the overall gun death rate in Maryland over the last 10 years. Over 80% of homicides in Maryland were committed with a firearm in 2019, and over 40% of Maryland suicides are accomplished with a firearm. Data shows us that suicides and suicide attempts are frequently committed on an impulse. So when the person in crisis has quick access to particularly lethal means of a firearm, we lose the chance that an unsuccessful attempt provides to get that person help. And now Corey is going to continue talking about Maryland data.
Hello, I am Corey Campbell, also from Maryland, March for Our Lives, Maryland. A lot is made of the gun violence problem in Baltimore, and it is certainly the driver of gun violence in the state, with a gun death rate per 100,000 people of 33.69. Interesting though, the next three highest rates in Maryland are Dorchester, Cecil, and Charles County respectively. 92% of all Maryland gun deaths are male, and Black men in the state ages 18 to 24 are nearly 38 times more likely than white men in the same age bracket to be murdered with a gun. Furthermore, we know that in 2020, 32 children and teens under the age of 18 died of gun-related death. And now over to Sid to talk about costs.
So one of the pushbacks that is often, get in trying to convince legislators to implement policies that may cost the state money is what new policies will cost. So legislators are often weighing the cost of one solution over another to juggle the limited resources that they must manage. And so therefore, it can be difficult to justify legislation that requires a large outlay of public funds. But in addition to the lives that are impacted, gun violence is a really costly affair. The Giffords Law Center has estimated that the cost of gun violence in Maryland works out to be $3.6 billion a year, or about $612 per resident, every single year. And the monetary cost of gun violence includes emergency and long-term medical costs, increases related to law enforcement funding, judiciary and criminal justice funding, and that's just to name a few. Someone in Maryland is killed every 13 hours. And so when we find ourselves, juggling people's lives and money, we see that there's issues in both sides. So this is an impactful bill, and it's important for legislators to pay attention to that. And now back to Karen to talk about this year's legislative efforts.
This legislative session, our top priority is passing an updated and stronger child access prevention law. Child access prevention laws are laws that permit authorities to criminally charge adults who knowingly or through negligent behaviors permit children to have access to firearms. Strong cap laws have been shown to reduce gun incidents involving youth. Under federal law, there is no requirement for gun owners to store their firearms safely, even if children are present. The state of Maryland has a law requiring firearms be sold with a locking device, but no law that mandates gun owners actually use those devices or to store their firearms safely. Our current cap law says that a person may not leave a loaded firearm where a child under the age of 16 would gain access to it. Storage requirements are not articulated, unloaded firearms are not included, and older teens are left out of this law. Furthermore, a violation of this warrants no more than a fine, regardless of the harm that ensues. Child access prevention is often marketed by gun industry advocates as gun control. It is not. No one is removing firearms or even limiting who can purchase firearms in this legislation. This is pure safety. Youth firearm access is a public health crisis. We know that it is so easy for many young people to gain access to firearms right in their own homes that recently, when a TikTok challenge calling for school shooting threats emerged, some school districts across the country decided to close for the day. And among those that didn't, many parents simply chose to keep their kid home that day. Because regardless of the seriousness of the social media ploy, we all know that the access youth have to firearms is all too easy. It puts all children at risk, but perhaps none more so than those who are experiencing a mental health crisis. Youth suicide is almost always an impulsive act. A young person contemplating suicide often makes the decision to act only moments before taking action. When lethal means are easily available, we don't give that young person the time to make a different decision. We don't give that person a chance to recover from a failed attempt and get the help they need because firearms don't fail at this deadly task. Maryland experiences about 13 youth firearm suicides every single year. These are entirely preventable deaths. We need to make it easier and more common to have discussions about what safe storage of firearms looks like, and especially so when there are youth present. We need that guidance to be firmly rooted in the law. Primary care doctors need to be able to guide patients and their parents in the safe storage of firearms. Most families who receive such guidance actually do improve their storage habits. Community education is a critical component to reducing the number of youths who will die prematurely from firearm-related trauma. This legislation works to reduce suicides, prevent unintentional firearm incidents by youth, prevent youth in crisis from causing harm to others, such as in school shootings and relationship violence, and reduce gun theft, which leads to guns diverted to the criminal markets. We know that currently in this country, about 4.6 million kids live in homes that have at least one loaded, unlocked gun. This accessibility under the guise of protection is literally killing our kids. Between 2009 and 2018, there was an 82% increase in gun suicides among minors. We know that when we manage to take a gun out of the equation, youth in crisis have a much higher likelihood of surviving a suicide attempt and getting the help that they need to get well. As if this wasn't enough, there are the school shootings. Over 221,000 kindergarten through 12 students have experienced a shooting at their school since Columbine, and more than 4 million students endured at least one lockdown during the 2017-2018 school year. Around 80% of school shooters obtain their firearm from a family member or friend who failed to secure the weapon adequately. America has the weakest gun laws and the most guns of any comparable nation. And the consequence of that is that we also have the most youth firearm deaths. 9 out of every 10 kids younger than 15 killed by firearms die in this country. Child access prevention and safe storage is an area of gun violence prevention that researchers have paid close attention to for a number of years. They've been able to both track new laws as well as analyze the effect of new cap laws and places where cap laws have been dismantled. The evidence is clear. Cap laws can reduce suicide, unintentional gun deaths, and injuries among children and teens by up to 54%. An estimated 100 lives a year could be saved with just modest improvements in safe storage habits. I have gun owners speak to me about the culture of gun ownership and the desire to have firearms accessible in the case of need to protect one's family and one's home. And certainly we do allow that in this country. No matter what your opinion is on guns, it is a protected right. What we need to do is find ways to effectively communicate the responsibility to store those firearms safely. And our law needs to be clear as to what that means. I hear far too often that my kids know not to touch my gun. What if they don't? What if you're wrong? What if your child is in crisis and actively seeking that gun that you told him not to touch? How difficult would it be for them to access it?
Hold on. I think I just heard something. I'm heading upstairs. It's not here. The gun's not here. What do you mean? Cam, Cameron, are you in there?
That video speaks to me, possibly especially so because my boys have always been into video games. The gun was stored in an easily accessible drawer, too easy. And yes, what a tragedy upon a tragedy that grieving parents might be held accountable here. And yet, We know that if we just make it harder for youth to access firearms, tragedies like that acted out in that video are far less likely to happen. As I close our discussion on child access, it is helpful to put a face to a problem. And this story, tragic as it is less tragic than many since the children involved survived. Even so, the lives of 2 children have been forever and significantly altered. On May 25th of 2020, Mayana Hinton and her 7-year-old cousin T entered a residence where another child showed them an unsecured gun. Not believing the gun was real, T pulled the trigger, shooting Mayana, the little girl you see in this photo. This beautiful little girl has spent the last 1.5 years dealing with the ramifications of this moment. While Mayana lay bleeding on the floor, the 23-year-old responsible for the firearm came in and took the firearm, leaving the injured child behind. He was ultimately convicted of carrying a pistol without a license and attempting to tamper with evidence and sentenced to 18 months. The prosecutor chose not to charge him with cruelty to children because it would have forced the already traumatized children to testify. And there was no option to charge him under a child access law. So while the person responsible for her devastating injury will be free in a few months, Mayana's struggle will continue indefinitely. But she's not the only one. T, her 7-year-old cousin, who is a daily part of her life, must carry the burden of Mayana's injuries for the rest of his. He's far too young to understand that he's not at fault. Both children will carry this awful moment forever. But the adult, well, he'll be free to do as he will soon and has the potential to have his record completely cleared by 2025. So we're switching gears now. Our other priority legislation this year is related to the proliferation of untraceable firearms, commonly referred to as ghost guns. These are privately made firearms that do not have a trackable serial number and therefore do not trigger the protections that exist under existing gun laws, like background checks and licensing. The kit in this photo sells for about $139 online. It needs a few other parts, which in total costs around $115, and a few general tools, drill bits, hand file, sandpaper, that kind of stuff, for a completed firearm that can be purchased by anyone with no background check or license, and which is otherwise not discernibly different from an off-the-shelf market model in its effectiveness. This short video from our friends at Giffords actually does a much better job of summarizing this issue than I could ever do. So here we go. Hopefully you can hear it.
These are some of the parts that make up a gun: a frame, barrel, slide, trigger components.
A ghost gun is a firearm manufactured from parts in the home of an unlicensed individual.
So there are a few ways to start your DIY gun fund. The first is to go to the licensed gun seller, buy a receiver, which has the serial number, and then pick out and order the rest of the parts you want. The second way, go to a website, buy a kit like this one or this one. It ships, you open it, and inside is your brand new 80% receiver.
An 80% receiver is a receiver that is 80% complete. You get the unfinished part that ATF does not consider a gun yet, and then their directions on how to use your drill and finish this part.
So if I can do this, anybody can do this.
A ghost gun in the hands of bank robbers, white supremacists charged in Maryland. The gun used in last week's deadly school shooting in Santa Clarita was a ghost gun. Law enforcement says they're untraceable.
When a manufacturer makes a gun, by federal law, that gun has to have a unique serial number.
A serial number on a gun is a key piece of evidence. It allows them to trace the gun from the manufacturer who built it, to the gun dealer who sold it, to the person who first bought it.
Since 1988, more than 7 million guns have been traced to solve crimes. But without a serial number, ghost guns are untraceable. Federal authorities say that nearly a third of firearms recovered in California are homemade, unserialized, and untraceable. It was 1968 when our federal gun laws were written. A lot has changed since then, especially technology.
And like many other aspects of our laws, they aren't keeping up with the speed of technology.
And that issue creates dangerous loopholes that make it far too easy for criminals to legally make their own guns. There's no way to know just how many ghost guns are in circulation. We do know that they're a trend, one that undermines our system, that nullifies our gun laws and our safety, and tips the scales entirely. One solution?
Limit the sale of receivers to those that have been completed and marked and serialized.
That would mean that those parts would be required to have a serial number, and sellers would need to conduct a background check. Washington State, California, Connecticut, and New Jersey are the only states with laws aimed at stemming the tide of these untraceable weapons. Changing the legal definition of a firearm would go a long way towards keeping guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them. And that means saving lives.
Okay, that might have actually worked better if I'd worked out how to make the volume work. So hopefully you got something out of that. I think I figured it out there at the end. But you can actually Google, go to YouTube and Google Giffords and ghost guns and find that video if you'd like to watch the whole thing and be able to hear it better than I clearly was able to get it to you. But nevertheless, I could not have summarized that better. So how did we get here? Unserialized firearms are not a new phenomenon. For decades, a firearm manufacturer sought clarification from the ATF on the question of when a piece of raw material becomes a firearm in the name of the law, in the eyes of the law. There has never been a clear answer, and generally the ATF has ruled on a case-by-case basis. Originally, the agency held that a substantial amount of effort that took ATF experts more than an hour to accomplish, had to be left to the buyer in order for a partially finished frame or receiver not to be ruled a firearm. However, about 15 years ago, ATF lowered this bar and provided specific written instructions on how to come as close as possible to creating a firearm without crossing the line. The ghost gun industry has exploded ever since. Ghost guns are turning up in crimes and investigations all over the state of Maryland. As pointed out in the video, I don't know if you could hear this part, even using Maryland example. They are the weapon of choice for extremist groups and have been recovered from youth in everything from school shootings to arms trafficking. While it has been possible to create your own firearms, probably since firearms were invented, advances in technology make access to parts and materials and instructions easier than ever to build your own gun. In Baltimore alone, the increases over the past few years are at over 800%. So where are we now? On May 7th of 2021, the Attorney General of the United States signed an ATF proposed rule designed to ensure the proper marking, record keeping, and traceability of all firearms manufactured, imported, acquired, and disposed of by federal firearm licensees. This rule would update the definition of firearms to include unfinished frames and receivers. Expectations are that this rule change will become final sometime in 2022. This change would ensure that people who wish to create their own firearms go through the same process and procedure and fulfill the same standards as people purchasing ready-made firearms. The end result would be that prohibited people would not be able to easily skirt gun regulations to acquire firearms, and therefore prohibited people would be much less likely to turn to privately made firearms to arm themselves. There are some obvious holes in the federal rulemaking. It can't touch existing parts or unserialized guns. It also could be repealed by a subsequent administration. Through the process of repealing a rule is more difficult than one would think, it is nevertheless possible that a future administration backed by the gun lobby would find this a priority. Through comprehensive federal legislation would be the best way to address these gaps. We do what we must, and we rely on our state legislators to act first. Maryland Attorney General Brian Frosh has made dealing with the growing problem of ghost guns a priority in the waning days of his administration. His team has worked 6 to 8 months with our organization, Giffords, Brady, Everytown, CIF, to craft legislation designed to fill the gaps in the proposed federal rule and provide a legislative safety net if the rule fails to clear the final hurdle or if it were to ever get repealed. There are a couple of things that the state legislation would be designed to do. First, it is designed to address the existing stocks of unserialized ghost guns and gun parts. Second, it seeks to line that system up with the federal requirements. Actually, I guess there are 3 things. And lastly, it seeks to provide a backdrop in the unlikely event that the federal rule does not get finalized or if it gets altered or repealed in the future. It should be made clear that the purpose of legislation pertaining to privately made firearms is not to penalize or prohibit the art form of gunsmithing. However, it should not be legal to use gunsmithing as a way of circumnavigating laws intending to ensure that firearms be kept out of the hands of prohibited people. As long as those wishing to make their own firearms do so with serialized parts, and that unserialized privately made firearms already in existence be brought into compliance, the practice would remain legal and acceptable within the framework constructed. So that is our summary of our 2 main priorities this session. So what happens next? Many of you are already familiar with the legislative process in Maryland. However, I am always hopeful that we've managed to engage some newbies. And I know that when I was in those shoes, the process explanations were very helpful to me. So I'll go over a little bit of it now. At this stage of things, the legislation that we've discussed tonight, it's already been worked on for months and even years in some cases, fine-tuning the language and vetting the data. Both pieces of legislation were then submitted to the Department of Legislative Services, a nonpartisan body within the Maryland General Assembly, for bill drafting. Legislators now put these drafts into the hopper for what we call first reader in front of the entire body of their respective house. The leader of that body then refers the bill to the appropriate committee or committees. For many gun bills, this is Judiciary Committee in the House and Judicial Proceedings in the Senate. In the case of our Child Access Bill submitted this year, we are also expecting it to go to multiple committees within the House and Senate, specifically Judiciary and Health and Government Operations in the House and JPR and Finance in the Senate. This is due to the addition of the education component directed toward the Maryland Department of Health. After first reader, hearings are held in committees. This is where testimony is submitted and debate is held. Subsequently, the committees hold voting sessions to decide whether to move a bill forward. If they do so, a second reader is performed on the floor of the respective house. Floor debate generally occurs at this point. The next step is third reader. Third reader is the final hurdle in that chamber. Both chambers must pass the bill through third reader for it to move to the governor for signature or veto. And here's where we have an added wrinkle this year. We have an outgoing governor who tends to veto all gun violence prevention legislation. In a normal year, a piece of vetoed legislation would come back in the beginning of the following session for an override. However, with an outgoing governor, this is not allowed. Therefore, this year, any legislation in which a veto is anticipated must pass early enough for there to be time to override the veto prior to the end of this session. Otherwise, the bill dies and we have to start over at the beginning in 2023. So that's a lot of detail, but hopefully you found at least some of that helpful. And now, now we come to the part where we try to answer some of the questions that are out there. Bonnie, do we have things in the queue?
Yes, we do. We have several questions for you. Lisa Morris asks if the Oxford High School situation and the parents being charged there will help create a new precedent in other states.
Yeah, so that's an interesting situation because I mean, it certainly got a lot of notice, and it got the attention of several legislators who were interested in talking about this issue and child access prevention after years of us trying to have these conversations with them. So certainly it has opened doors for those conversations to proceed. That situation is egregious, right? Like the parents in that particular shooting had so many flags, so many warnings that something was going on. They'd been asked to do things that they refused to do. That in that state, they're being charged under those extreme negligence laws. So they also don't have a cap law. If they had a cap law, it would be easier to prosecute. And certainly I think that is open, that option is open to many other states and probably even Maryland if we had a situation that was quite that level. But yeah, I mean, I think this is parents don't need to be quite as horrible as the parents in that particular setting to be responsible in these type of shootings. So, I mean, I'm not sure if I answered the question or just walked all around it, but yes, I mean, that is one of the things that we're looking at that CAP could help address.
Thank you. We'll stay on CAP for one more minute here. There are a couple of questions about the penalties, about the structure for penalties and misdemeanors versus felonies and jail time. And so a couple of questions, just wondering what that structure looks like.
What it actually is. Okay. And I pull this out so I would have it right in front of me so I wouldn't get it wrong. Okay, so there are 3 tiers to the penalties. It is not considered a felony. The first tier is imprisonment not exceeding 90 days or a fine not exceeding 1,000. The second tier is not exceeding 2 years and a fine not exceeding 2,500. And the third tier is not exceeding 3 years or a fine not exceeding 5,000. And it's basically the first tier is person is caught in a situation where a child could have gained access. The second one is the child did gain access, but no harm was caused. And the third is a child has gained access and some harm has been caused.
Thank you. We have Lynn Olson from Montgomery County Women's Democratic Club. First of all, she wrote that they will be supporting CAP and Ghost Guns legislation. So thank you for that, Lynn. We're glad to have your support. She has asked if Leslie Lopez's bill will incorporate the AG's recommendations. And she's also asking what the 3 most important points for each piece of legislation are that people should include when they're reaching out.
Yeah, I believe so I don't, who knows what's going to happen in Maryland General Assembly before it actually happens. But the way we understand it is Brian Frosch's bill is the bill. And because of the way it's being put forward, Leslie Lopez is going to be the advocate for it. So essentially that is her bill, if that makes any sense at all. The dynamic has changed quite a bit since last year, so it was never going to be, it was never going to work to just reintroduce the same bill that she had last year, because now we have this stuff going on at the federal level. So we have to take that into consideration. So she's still, probably the person on the hot seat when it comes to the hearing. But I believe we are talking about that. She's been part of these conversations that we've been having with the AG's office.
Great. And what would you say the 3 most important points are for each CAP and Ghost Guns when people are reaching out?
Ooh, 3 most important points. I guess I would say when you're reaching out, number 1, target your own legislators, target legislators on the hearing committees with whatever comments and support. And especially if you have legislators that are yours that are on these hearing committees, let them know that as a constituent, you support this and you want them to support that. I think I'm seeing people asking about bill numbers, but there are no bill numbers yet. We hope to have some sometime this week, but we don't have them yet. And then I'd say for CAP, there's so many. I have so many things that you could rely on. I shared a lot of data tonight in this, and certainly you can pick and choose from whatever spoke to you the loudest. In terms of adding, you don't have to dump it all in, just grab something and share that with your legislators. And then for Ghost Guns, the same. I mean, the Baltimore numbers, I think alone, we've tried to track down Maryland numbers as well, but for our understanding and the AG's understanding is that Maryland State Police are not necessarily tracking those numbers of Ghost Guns the same way Baltimore is, but Baltimore's increase in numbers is quite stunning and is certainly something to be shared. And lastly, I'd just say that as you're sharing things, talk to your friends and see if you can get them to do so as well. We're having another weird session where we can't just necessarily show up and knock on office doors and try to get people's attention. So tweet about it. I think I'm finding that social media wise, Twitter is probably the only way, or the one method that you can try to get legislator attention. Email them, certainly. Send them a physical postcard if it strikes you as something that you would like to do, and phone calls. And I know there are some events coming up that are in Annapolis if you're interested in showing up and being seen. That works as well.
Thanks, Karen. Janet Holbrook was looking for a little more clarification about the legality of owning Ghost Guns if you're an adult. I know you spoke to that some, but could you give a little more clarification there?
Of owning, do you know whether from the question it's owning, like currently owns a Ghost, what's going to happen under this legislation? So my understanding is that Ghost Guns will not be illegal if you currently possess them. You will simply be asked to bring them into compliance. So in other words, there'll be a system that meshes with the federal system in terms of serialization that would allow you to take your current firearm that is unserialized and get it serialized and bring it into compliance. And of course, it's never going to be a bill gets passed and suddenly you're holding an illegal weapon. There's going to be some period of time for people to bring those things into compliance, and it'll be parts as well as currently created, I guess, firearms.
Thanks. One last question here is Melissa's asking if you could tell her a little more again about the time issue with the governor for this year.
Don't quote me on this because I'm not sure my math is correct, but basically in a normal year, the governor has certain timelines that he has to abide by in terms of when he's handed a passed bill. He's got to either sign it or veto it within a certain amount of time, or it automatically becomes a law, right? So the difference is this year that when he would veto a bill in prior years, in past years, what it doesn't really matter how much time is left in the legislative session. But this year, he's outgoing. So he's not going to be in that role when session comes back in 2023. So because of that, the rule is that a vetoed bill dies and we would have to completely bring it back. And that means going through all the hearings and all of it all over again. And we all know how hard that is. That is what it is. So I think the way I've got it figured, I believe it's somewhere, we've got till about March 11th to actually present it to the governor. Now, I could be a little bit off on days there. So, don't quote me exactly, but I'm close if that's not accurate.
Thanks. We have more for you. So people are asking, is it an either or for contact? Should they email? Should they tweet? Should they call?
Not really. I'd say certainly any one of those things that you do is helpful. But if you've got it in you to do more of them, then do it all. It's just what you have the bandwidth for. In past years, we had guidance as to what was most effective. I think in this world where we're all living virtually, in session, originally the Senate was going to be letting hearings take place in person, but with the newest outbreaks, they put a pause on that. So hopefully that's starting to die down. The virus is starting to die down a little bit. And after they reevaluate, I think mid-February, maybe we'll be let back in the building again. So certainly whenever you're allowed to show up in person, that's also helpful. But yeah, any and all that you're willing. I don't think it's an either or.
Great. We also have a question about the red flag BRPO laws. If someone has a gun and you feel that I'm having trouble finding here, but if you're worried about someone not securing their gun, should you use the red flag law to solve the problem?
I don't think so. Not unless you're talking about a situation where, if you have some indication that somebody's in crisis, then perhaps. And Liz, I just saw popped up, so she might be better able to speak to.
No, just to be clear, the red flag, which is we refer to as the extreme risk protective order, that's really to be used in circumstances where you feel someone is a risk to themselves or someone else. So we know that safe storage helps reduce suicidality. So I think the two, are aligned in some way. But if someone is simply not securing a weapon safely, we obviously see that as a public health issue. But it is not grounds for seeking a petition for the removal of a gun. Just to be clear, the petition to remove a gun is something when you think someone is a risk to themselves, to someone else. And obviously we see that sort of situation as being a risk to a child, but I think that again, that's why we're pursuing this through different means, through different legislative means. Because that's not the intent of the extreme risk protective bill.
So I see that we are right after 7 o'clock, and I had promised that this was supposed to be about an hour. So Bonnie, is there something that you think we want to close with one more question, or?
I think that we just want to reiterate, Liz has put in the chat, but I want to go ahead and call it out there again that I'm going to drop the link. If you need to find out who your representatives are to contact, you should be looking for 2 delegates and 1 state senator, and we will send out action alerts, and you can get updates on our website. and as well, and Facebook. So definitely keep up the fight.
Bonnie, and so that's all we have time for tonight. I really hope that you found this helpful and that you will all reach out to your legislators and your friends and ask them to support these very important pieces of legislation. We are very excited about the state of both of these pieces of legislation, and we're optimistic that legislators are ready to do the hard work of getting these passed this year. Let's make sure that they know that the citizens of the state expect no less. Thank you and good night.